I'm Susanna Reese at the Northeastern IPM Center. Welcome to Stop Pest in Housing webinar, the ABCs of Pest Control, Allergens, Baits, and Cockroaches. Stop Pest is supported by an interagency agreement with the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture and HUD's Office of Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control. With this support, we provide free on-site training to qualifying housing providers and technical assistance. Our goal is to improve pest control and affordable housing. So to find out more information, you can visit our website, stoppest.org, or email me at stopppests@cornell.edu. And all our little links are across the bottom of the page, you can see. Let's see, today we are fortunate to have Dr. Coby Shaw with us. Dr. Shaw's a Blanton J. Whitmire Distinguished Professor at the Department of Entomology at North Carolina State University. He's one of our most prominent cockroach specialists in the country and one of the few people that I know about really looking at the impacts of integrated pest management on cockroach control and reducing allergens in the home. And that's an area that's of significant importance to all of us working in housing. I want to thank him for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us to learn more about how we can promote effective and safe ways to reduce cockroaches and their associated allergens. We're going to start very soon, but I have a few housekeeping things. You can follow the link on this page to download the PDF of today's presentation, and that link will be up, that page will be up for forever, and you can go back to that page and find the PDF. We'll eventually have the recording up there and a certificate of completion. When after you've watched, you can download that and fill out that certificate of completion. If you have any audio issues during the broadcast, you probably can't hear me now, but you can scroll over the top of your screen and an option should come up that says Test Audio, and you can change your audio options and settings if you are having trouble. And Nancy has been kind enough to put the phone number in the chat box, so you can always call in if you can't get your speakers to work. But if your speakers don't work, you probably can't hear me saying this anyway, so we'll use the chat box. I muted all participants upon entry, but we will take questions. Please use the chat box, not the Q&A, so we can keep track of that in one place. And when you write a question into the chat box, please direct it to all. We'll do our best to answer the questions, but we'll do that at the end. So I hope you can all stay with us and till the end, and I will read your questions to Dr. Schal and get answered as many as we can. If you don't get your question answered during the presentation or after the presentation, please try to email me at stopppests@cornell.edu. with any pressing questions. And I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. Finally, there's going to be a link that pops up at the end of the presentation, which will take you to our webinar evaluation form, and we'd appreciate it if you could help us by filling that out. This screen is not correct. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Schal to begin his presentation, and I appreciate your patience for a moment as we switch presenters. And Dr. Schal, are you ready to share your screen?
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susanna, and thank you, Nancy, for all the work behind the scenes there. It's a pleasure to be with you all. What I wanted to cover today is the topic of cockroaches, the importance of cockroaches, why we control cockroaches, and how to control or eliminate cockroaches. So on the first slide there, I have the outline of my presentation, the major topics that we'll cover. So the outline of my presentation is on a slide, and then on the left side of the slide, I will kind of go through as we move through the outline, we'll move through these various topics. I'll give you a couple of contact items, my email, if anyone's interested in sending me questions offline, any concerns that you have about housing and in relationship to pests, I'll be glad to interact with you via email. If you're interested in the more technical side of things, I also give you a website for my lab website, which has all of our published works in PDF format. So if you really want to, you can download some 250 publications. Good luck. So let's start with a very important question, and that is why. Oops, there we go. Why do we control cockroaches? Many people feel that cockroaches are sort of just a nuisance, and we need to get rid of cockroaches because they're a nuisance. But I want to convince you that cockroaches need to be gotten rid of because of very important medical reasons, and that those medical reasons far outweigh the nuisance factors associated with cockroaches. So because cockroaches need three major things to exist in our home. They need food, they need water, and they need shelter. And the two places in the home where they get all three of these things, one is the bathroom, where they get organic material as well as water, and the other is the kitchen. And the fact that cockroaches, the German cockroach, moves readily between the bathroom and the kitchen, going back and forth, it has the potential to pick up all sorts of enteric bacteria, all sorts of microbes, fungi in a bathroom, and move them into the kitchen and move them into to our food and to our utensils. So the potential for disease transmission is quite great. And in fact, various researchers that have looked at microbes associated with cockroaches routinely isolate all sorts of nasty organisms, pathogenic organisms from cockroaches. Be those fungi like Alternaria, or more commonly, various types of bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli and all sorts of other bacteria that can cause primarily enteric type problems, gastrointestinal type problems. If anyone's interested in following up on this aspect of cockroaches, I wrote a chapter for this book called The Handbook of Pest Control by Malice. There's chapter 2 is on cockroaches, and I have a very long list of microorganisms that cockroaches carry with them, primarily concentrating on the German cockroach. I want to show you an example of some of the work that we have done showing the importance of cockroaches from a medical perspective. Here in North Carolina, where I live, we have a huge number of pig farms in southeastern North Carolina. And the video that you're seeing shows a cockroach-infested pig farm. And we have many of these pig farms. We have some 12 million pigs in North Carolina, only 10 million people. And it's a very important component of North Carolina's agricultural economy. But what comes with pigs, unfortunately, is antibiotic use. So they use a lot of antibiotics to keep the pigs healthy, but also to promote the growth of the pigs. Because they're using so much antibiotics, there's a lot of antibiotic resistance amongst the microbes associated with the pigs. So we conducted a study back in 2011, and I show you on the slide the study. If anyone's interested in downloading this, this is open access, so you can readily download this, and you can also download it from my lab website. What we showed very, very quickly, just to summarize, what we showed is that the microbes that the cockroaches carry and the antibiotic resistance genes that the cockroaches carry are identical to those that come from the pig feces. So the message, the take-home message here is that cockroaches basically interact with the environment. They pick up things from the environment. If the environment is the bathroom, they pick up things in the bathroom. If the environment is a pig facility, a pig farm, they pick up microorganisms from the pigs, and are then able to transfer those microorganisms and the genes, the antibiotic resistance genes associated with them, to the human community. We did the survey in Raleigh, North Carolina, an urban center. We didn't find any of this. So it's very clear that the cockroaches are picking up these antibiotic-resistant microbes from the pigs on a pig farm and delivering them or transporting them to the human community. So this is a very important medical reason for controlling cockroaches on pig farms, in hospitals, in nursing homes, in homes for the elderly, and obviously in affordable homes where there's obviously we have bathrooms and we have kitchens, and that kind of interaction can take place. Another very important reason to control cockroaches is that cockroaches have been shown for the past 30 years or so to be very important producers of allergens that affect people. When we think of allergens, we think of pollen, we think of cats, we think of dogs, we think of mice. We occasionally even think of dust mites that cause allergies in people. But if you look at this graph, this is a survey that was done of almost 1,000 homes throughout the United States, and this survey has shown that the cockroach is the most prominent producer of allergens, and the cockroach causes more allergic disease than any of these other things that I mentioned. So this is a very important thing to know, especially when it comes to inner city, affordable, low-income type communities. A study back in 1997 showed that 37% of inner city children that have asthma are sensitized to cockroach allergens. So the cockroaches produce these incredibly potent allergens. They deposit those allergens in the home. The allergens become airborne, and children especially and the elderly can inhale those allergens, and those allergens can trigger allergic reactions, and most significant, they can trigger asthmatic reactions that can be quite severe. And here's a graph that shows a very clear relationship as you increase the number of cockroaches in the infestation. And here we're going from 1 cockroach to 10,000 cockroaches, which is not that unusual in an infestation. As you increase the number of cockroaches, you also increase the amount of allergen in the home. And the relationship is fairly linear. As we have more cockroaches, we have more allergens. Now, just to put things in perspective, if you look at the slide, a single female cockroach can produce about 1,500 units of this allergen called BLAG1 per day. So that would place that single cockroach way up on this Y scale, on this Y-axis scale, indicating that we really need to eradicate cockroaches rather than just controlling them, because just a few cockroaches, just 2 or 3 cockroaches can produce enough allergens to exacerbate allergic disease and asthma in the home. So just to recap this section, we're still talking about why are we controlling cockroaches? What is the significance, the medical significance of cockroaches? Cockroaches carry and vector pathogenic microbes, including antibiotic resistance microbes and the genes that they carry. Cockroaches also produce very potent allergens that can trigger asthma, especially in sensitized inner city children. And of course, something we didn't talk about is that cockroaches contaminate foods. They can damage electrical circuits. They can short circuit televisions and computers, etc. And therefore, it's really critical that we control cockroaches, that we engage in some type of pest control interventions. But the more pest control interventions we do, and especially when we use traditional approaches using insecticides, the more insecticides we place in a home. So there's a very large amounts of insecticides that are used and often misused to control cockroaches. And so we have this sort of two-edged sword. On the one hand, we want to control cockroaches, but on the other hand, we want to prevent the use of large amounts of insecticides. And so clearly the solution to this is integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is a procedure that strives to achieve long-term environmentally sound pest suppression of cockroaches, of insects in general, of pests in general, through the use of a wide variety of technological and management practices, while at the same time reducing the hazards of the pest and also the hazard associated with pesticide use. So the basis of integrated pest management, I'm sure you've all heard about this in the past, the basis of integrated pest management is to use multiple approaches, a variety of approaches to control the pest, but to start with prevention of the pest by limiting resources that the pest requires. So in an earlier slide, I showed you the cockroach requires water, food, and shelter. Basic to IPM is the elimination of those resources to lower the cockroach population. But then we move through various interventions that sometimes increase in toxicity to get pest elimination. So on this pyramid, we want to engage more in cultural and sanitation type practices. We want to eliminate food, eliminate water that provides cockroaches with the proper habitat. We want to physically and mechanically prevent cockroaches from being happy in the home before we start using pesticides. When we do use pesticides, there's a range of pesticide formulations that we can use. We can use baits and insect growth regulators. They're relatively safer than things like dusts and ultimately sprays and residual insecticides. So the general theme of IPM is to engage in things that are least toxic, and when using pesticides, consider the toxicity of the pesticide, starting with baits, and only if we must, we go to sprays and residual insecticides. And we'll come back to this area in a few minutes. So let me go back. IPM is great, the concept is great, but it's important to recognize that there are many obstacles to the implementation of IPM. Some of these obstacles are perceived, and some of those may be real. And some of the perceived obstacles are things like that IPM is expensive, IPM requires more education. That's a real constraint of IPM, that it requires more education, and some people view that as an obstacle. But very importantly, do-it-yourself products. So the consumer can go to the supermarket and pick up and use in the home. Some of these do-it-yourself products really create a very significant obstacle to the implementation of IPM. So some of the challenges that we have with implementing IPM is that IPM is perceived to be more expensive, and I put a question mark because later on I'll show you that that is not the case. IPM is perceived to be more labor intensive, and I'll show you that that is not the case as well. IPM requires better sanitation to eliminate food sources that compete with baits, and that is clearly the case, but I will show you that baits can bypass some of these constraints. Even with poor sanitation, baits can work quite well if they're effectively deployed. IPM requires more training and education and cooperation from residents, and this is very important. It's always good to get the most training in IPM. It takes time to do that, but that's obviously what you're doing right now, is getting some training and education in IPM. And a very important challenge to IPM and to any pest management procedure is insecticide resistance. There's insecticide resistance to both sprays and baits, and as we implement IPM, it's important to recognize that insects can become resistant to the approaches that we use to control them. And it's important to monitor and to recognize that we need to change our procedures as the insects become resistant to them. The two most important constraints or obstacles to IPM implementation, I think, one is contracts. Often, multifamily homes have contracts with pest control companies, and the contracts explicitly call for monthly or quarterly sprays. And so the pest control company is constrained by having to spray, whereas we would prefer that they bait, for example, or that they use IPM. So it's important to revise the types of contracts that are in place to give the pest control company a bit more leeway in being able to move to an IPM program. And a very important obstacle to the implementation of IPM is competing do-it-yourself products, and by far the most important obstacle is TRFs, or total release foggers, and some of the aerosol sprays that you see under people's kitchen, in people's cabinets. And I want to go through a project that describes how the TRFs are such a major obstacle. So what are TRFs? TRFs are total release foggers. Some of you know them as bug bombs or bombs. They're basically total release aerosols. They contain one class of insecticides called pyrethroids, and they also contain synergists. These are compounds that make the pyrethroids work better. And there's all kinds of names associated with these. We don't need to go through that. Very importantly, the TRFs, or the insect bombs, also contain inert ingredients that include aerosol propellants. So these are solvents that are often very flammable. And because they're flammable, often this is what you see. You get someone uses the TRFs inappropriately and blows up their apartment and can blow up a whole apartment complex. It's incredible how little we know about TRFs. So the authoritative study that was done on TRFs was a compilation that was done by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and they looked at TRF use in the United States from 2000, actually in 8 states in the United States, from 2001 to 2006. So it's a 5-year period. And they found 466 TRF-related events or accidents. In New York City alone, there are about 4 to 8 explosions per year, and these explosions often result in apartment-wide fires. And quoting from this report, they say the TRFs pose a risk for acute, usually temporary health effects among users and bystanders. But what really drew my attention to this report was the report also stated that the TRFs can reduce pest populations and often are used by consumers as a low-cost alternative to professional pest control services. And what I became very interested in understanding is whether the things in red are in fact true. Can the TRFs reduce pest populations? And are they really a low-cost alternative to professional pest control services? So in order to address this empirically, to do experiments to address this, we initiated a project to look at the efficacy of TRFs versus baits. And if the TRFs fail, why do they fail? And the answer is because of insecticide resistance. So we got some funding from the Housing and Urban Development and from the Environmental Protection Agency to conduct the following study. And I'll briefly summarize the study. We went into apartment complexes, 5 apartment complexes in Raleigh, North Carolina. We selected 6 apartments per complex, and we deployed one TRF type. So we went to a supermarket and bought several different TRFs from different companies, and we deployed one TRF type per complex. As a control, we also had bait treatments. So we had bait treatments in these complexes as well. And these complexes are not the types of complexes that you find in New York City or in very big urban centers. These are low-rise, affordable housing here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Some of these may be townhouses, but most of these are apartments. The study consisted of the following. So we identified apartments that had cockroaches. About 3 to 6 months before we started doing the TRF work, we collected cockroaches from all these apartments and raised them in a laboratory. And the reason we did this is because we want to bring these cockroaches back into the apartment to see how the TRFs affect the cockroaches. And you'll see that in a second. So 3 to 6 months before we started the TRF work, we collected cockroaches and raised them in a laboratory. About 3 to 7 days before we used the TRFs, we went to these apartments and we sampled the apartments for allergen level, for number of cockroaches, and for pesticide residues. So we sampled for allergens by vacuuming the kitchen and the bedroom. We sampled for cockroaches by putting cockroach traps, basically Roach Motels, in the kitchen and trapped cockroaches. And on the bottom here, you see the results of one night of trapping. We get lots of cockroaches in these traps. And then we did residue swabs. So we took a section of the floor and a section of the wall and a section of the countertop and swabbed it with a solvent to see how much pesticide was on these surfaces. On the day of the intervention, that is the day that we deployed the TRF, this is a massive undertaking. The pilot lights need to go out. We basically have to follow the label directions of the TRF products. The windows and doors have to be closed. Pets and people have to vacate the place for about 6 hours. All the dishes have to be covered. So here, the dishes and small appliances are covered with newspapers and other things. And now we took the cockroaches that we collected from this apartment, and we put them in open cages, but in such a way that the cockroaches cannot escape from the cages, and put them on the floor of the apartment, as well as in the kitchen cabinet. And we have two sets of cockroaches. We have one set of cockroaches that was collected in the apartment and returned to that apartment, and another set of cockroaches that we raise in the laboratory. And we call these cockroaches our WIMP cockroaches. These cockroaches have been in the laboratory for about 50 or 60 years, and they have never experienced insecticides. So they are incredibly susceptible to all insecticides. And then we release the TRF. So you release the TRF, you vacate the premises, you go away for 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours later, we come back, we ventilate the apartments, we clean up, and we do pesticide residues again. So we swab the floor, the wall, and the countertops. And over time, for the next 3 months, we collect cockroaches. We determine whether the TRFs affected the cockroach population by putting Roach Motels and looking for the number of cockroaches in the apartment. We again collect residues, so we have 375 residue swabs over the next 3 months. And we collect allergen samples to see if we have affected the allergen level in these apartments. So this is a pretty massive undertaking. Here are the critical results. So we start at time 0, we start with a very large population in each one of these treatments. So we have 4 different TRF treatments. It doesn't matter what these TRFs are, because all the TRFs basically behave the same way. And we have 2 bait treatments. These are sort of our gold standard control, if you will. And what you can see is that we start with very high populations of cockroaches, about 100 to 120 cockroaches per apartment per night. And what you can see is the TRFs over time, over the next 4 weeks, did not affect the cockroach population. The cockroach populations in all treatments, all TRF treatments, remain the same. On the other hand, the cockroach populations in a bait treatments, we have 2 bait treatments here, decline dramatically. So within 2 weeks, we go from 160 cockroaches down to about less than 20 cockroaches. And so the cockroach population drops significantly when we use baits, but not when we use TRFs. What we then did, after 4 weeks, we decided to convert these TRF apartments into bait treatments. So at 4 weeks, we use baits to control the cockroaches. And within 2 weeks, you can see declines in all these apartments. So the message here is very simple. The TRFs do not work, and the baits very clearly do work. What about these Sentinel cockroaches that we put out there? And if you look at our WIMP cockroaches, these are the laboratory-raised cockroaches, whether they're exposed, in other words, they're placed on the floor right next to the TRF, or whether they're concealed, in other words, they're placed in the cabinet, these WIMP cockroaches die when exposed to TRF vapors, to the TRF residues. So these TRFs actually have very strong insecticides that can very readily kill our laboratory wimpy cockroaches. However, when we do the same thing with the wild cockroaches, these are the cockroaches we collected in the apartment and brought back to the same apartment, these TRFs barely touch them. A few of them die, maybe up to 20 or 30% of them die, but the other 80 to 70% of them survive this very, very extensive insecticide deposition. So there's obviously a problem with the use of TRFs, and the question is, why do the TRFs not work? And the answer is very simple. The answer, TRFs obviously work against our laboratory cockroaches, but they do not work against the field, the apartment cockroaches. And the answer is insecticide resistance. This is classical, what we call classical Darwinian natural selection. This is survival of the fittest. As we use insecticide to control insect populations, some resistant individuals, denoted by red here in this population, some of the individuals become resistant to the insecticide. As we use more insecticide to control the cockroaches, the number of susceptible individuals, the blue individuals, are eliminated, and the number of resistant individuals, the red individuals, increases in the population. And as we continue to use insecticides, we put these insects through a bottleneck where eventually we get only the resistant individuals surviving, because they're survival of the fittest, right? They're the fittest. And the wimpy ones, the wimpy cockroaches, die. Eventually we get a population of resistant insects, and this is where we get failure to control the insects with the insecticide. And that's basically what's happening with these insecticides that are contained within the TRFs. They're called pyrethroids. We can show the same thing in the laboratory. We can take a pyrethroid, in this case, a pyrethroid called cypermethrin, and using these syringes, we can apply a very tiny amount of these insecticides to the insects. When we apply these insecticides to the insects, to our laboratory strain of cockroaches, we can establish that it takes about 45 nanograms, a very tiny amount of insecticide, to kill 50% of the cockroaches that are raised in the laboratory. When we do the same type of thing with cockroaches collected from the apartments, we find that here it takes 10,000 nanograms to kill these cockroaches. So these cockroaches are 200-fold resistant to this insecticide. So the reason why we're unable to control cockroaches with these TRFs is because cockroaches throughout the United States, and this actually applies to bed bugs as well, just applies to every pest that has experienced a lot of these types of insecticides, they have developed very high level of insecticide resistance, especially pyrethroid resistance, and that in turn results in very low efficacy, or our inability to control the insects with this insecticide. So just to summarize here, if we look at the comparative efficacy of the total release foggers, the TRFs, and bait products in relation to insecticide resistance. So I have on the left here, I have the total release foggers. On the right, I have gel baits, which are the best baits that we have out there. Basically, what we have shown is that the TRFs have no efficacy. They're completely ineffective, and they're ineffective both on our Sentinel cockroaches as well as on the apartment cockroaches. In contrast, the gel baits, as I showed you, and I'll show you more data on this, they're highly efficacious. They result in population reduction, and they result in very long-term efficacy. This is very important. The total release foggers there's very high resistance against the insecticides in total release foggers, and there are very few options, because the total release foggers, there's only one class of insecticides that can be put into total release foggers, and that class is the pyrethroids. In contrast, the gel baits have very low resistance. The insecticides have very low resistance to, the insects have very low resistance to the insecticides. And even when they do have resistance, there are many options, because there are many different classes of insecticides that can be put into the gel baits. I didn't show you these data, but with the total release foggers, there's no change in the allergen level. With baits, I'll show you in a few minutes, there's massive reduction in allergen level when we use baits. We were concerned about the cost. People are really concerned about the cost of baiting. The cost of TRFs is somewhere between $7 and $14, but is it worth spending $7 to $14 per apartment when you have zero efficacy? The cost of a bait is also about $7 to $14, depending on how much you buy. But the bait is effective for six months to a year. So the efficacy of the bait is incredible. It's quite good. So clearly the bait outweighs the TRFs. In terms of labor, this is one of the big misconceptions. People think that the labor associated with TRFs is minimal. In fact, the labor associated with TRFs is massive. The preparation, the removal of pets, the vacating the home for 4 to 6 hours, the cleanup is incredibly expensive in terms of time, whereas the gel baits can apply it in 30 to 45 minutes per apartment, relatively inexpensive whether the consumer does it or a professional does it. It's really substantially less expensive. And very importantly, something that we don't think about often, with the TRFs, we got extensive insecticide residues, pesticide residues, massive residues that we have not seen in homes in all of our studies. This is a huge human health concern, whereas with baits, we have very minimal translocation of the bait to non-target areas. The bait pretty much stays where we put it and it doesn't move, whereas these TRFs just distribute the insecticide throughout the kitchen. And that's really problematic. Okay, so now we're shifting our discussion from TRFs to a bit more discussion about baits. So these are the various options, the various pest control options from a chemical perspective that we have. We can go from physical approaches using traps to all sorts of chemical approaches, TRFs, for example, using pyrethroids, residual sprays using different types of insecticides, various dust formulations, all the way to baits that have a lot of different insecticides associated with them. The message that I hope I got across to you is that the TRFs should be removed from our usage, that we should take them off our shopping list. And we should try to convince consumers not to use the TRFs because they're polluting their environment with massive amounts of insecticides, and they're really interfering with the use of baits. I didn't discuss this, but using TRFs, oftentimes people put pyrethroid insecticides on top of bait placements and making the baits less appealing to the cockroach. So what I want to shift is from a discussion of TRF to a discussion of baits. And why are baits so effective? So the question is, why do baits work so well? And this is where the biology of the cockroach becomes really important. This is the life cycle of the cockroach. The cockroach starts from an egg case that looks like this, and the cockroach grows from a small nymph to a very large nymph, and eventually to an adult male or adult female. This is called the hemimetabolous life cycle, or an incomplete type of development. What that means, much like the bed bug, but unlike a butterfly, for example, is that at every stage of the life cycle, the insect needs to eat, and it eats the same thing at every stage of the life cycle. So for a nymph to molt to another nymph, to grow and to molt to the next stage, it must eat. And therefore, the baits can target every single stage in the life cycle of the cockroach. This is very important. So it gives us sort of a weak link to every single stage in the life cycle of the cockroach. The other reason why baits are so incredibly effective is from a concept that we call bioavailability. If we look at the availability of the active ingredient, the insecticide, in different formulations, the bait is most effective because it's ingested. Residual sprays are somewhat effective because the insect contacts them, but the residual insecticides need to penetrate the insect through the cuticle. It's kind of like going through the skin of the insect. And the TRFs are much worse in that the TRFs are dispersed throughout the whole house, and then the insect has to contact the TRF in order to die. So The baits are very effective because the insect ingests them, and the insect ingests a massive dose of the insecticide. Here, comparing sprays and baits. Why are the baits so much more effective than the sprays? The sprays, as all of you know, are very, very difficult to use in a cluttered environment. If you have clothing and sort of cluttered bedroom and kitchen and living room, it's very difficult to spray around the clutter. In contrast, we can go in with baits. Of course, we prefer the clutter be removed, but we can work around the clutter with baits and put base placements where the cockroach are, where the cockroaches are, away from the clutter. Both sprays and baits have very long-lasting residual. The baits are effective for months. Some sprays, of course, are effective for months as well. The sprays are generally very broad spectrum. The sprays are usually neurotoxins, so they're very broad spectrum. The baits, on the other hand, have very specific target sites. We place the baits in very specific point sources, and the baits target the insect. Most of the insecticides in baits target the insect much more specifically than they target humans and pests and pets. So the targeting of a pest is much more effective. The baits require very extensive coverage. So in other words, they require a lot of active ingredient, literally grams of active ingredient placed in an apartment, whereas the baits are placed in very small point sources, much, much less active ingredient use. Although the cockroach, because it eats the bait, the cockroach actually encounters much more insecticide through the bait than through the spray. As I mentioned already with TRFs, the sprays and TRFs, we have massive problems with resistance to the active ingredients. We do have some problems with resistance to baits, but much less so than to the residual sprays. In addition, with the baits, we also have some benefits. We have the benefits of secondary kill, so-called the domino effect, where some cockroaches eat the bait and then go back to their shelters, their hiding places. They defecate the bait, and other individuals within that shelter eat the defecated bait and die. So there are all sorts of added benefits to the use of baits. What I want to go through is a study that we did, again, here in North Carolina, in these types of apartments. These are incredibly cluttered apartments, incredibly infested. These are all dead cockroaches within cabinets. And I want to show you the effectiveness of baits without any other intervention, just baits alone. I want to show you a study that we conducted demonstrating the effectiveness of baits. So what we did was we went to apartments in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we chose apartments that are highly infested, apartments that had somewhere between 50 and 1,000 cockroaches that we were able to trap on sticky traps. We then divided the apartments into two groups of apartments. One group of apartments above this blue line received a very complex IPM intervention, and another set of apartments below this blue line received a very received no intervention. They served as control. So in both sets of apartments, we monitored the cockroach population with sticky traps, as seen by this yellow, the yellow bars. In the intervention apartments, these treatment apartments, we extensively use baits. In this case, we use Max Force with hydromethylnon, but it doesn't matter. There's lots of products that can be used. We used it very extensively at the beginning and then kind of reduced the amount of bait that we used over time. We also sampled for allergen within the homes, but part of the IPM program was also to do extensive education. So we engaged the people the residents living in these apartments. We provided them with fact sheets. We had meetings to tell them about getting rid of cockroaches, how to clean up the apartment. We gave each apartment a vacuum cleaner, and we also called in a professional cleaning service to clean all of these apartments. Again, with extensive cleaning early and sort of a reduced cleaning subsequently. So this is a very extensive IPM, very extensive and expensive IPM undertaking. Whereas down here, these apartments are control apartments where we just monitor the apartments for cockroaches and we monitor the apartments for allergens. We want to see if the allergen level is affected. Here's what the apartments look like, and this is a video showing one of those apartments, highly infested. As you can see, these are remnants of cockroaches, lots of egg cases. These are live cockroaches on an air conditioning vent. All of these fecal pellets are fecal smears from cockroaches, massive, massive infestations of cockroaches. And this is inside the kitchen cabinet. So I think you're convinced that this is a very, very infested places, and what we want to know is, can we eliminate or can we reduce these cockroaches using this type of intervention? Here are the results of the study, and they surprised the heck out of us. I mean, amazing results. So here's the apartments, the treatment apartments and the control apartments at time 0, at the beginning of the study. Both sets of apartments had on average, about 300 cockroaches per apartment. The control apartments, the apartments where we did nothing, we just monitored the apartments, are in blue, and you can see that the number of cockroaches 6 months later remained the same. You know, a slight drop in the cockroaches, but nothing statistically significant here. On the other hand, the apartments where we did this massive intervention, we had a greater than 97% reduction in these apartments, from 308 cockroaches per apartment all the way down to 12 cockroaches per apartment. And in some apartments, we had complete elimination. We had 0 cockroaches in these apartments. So we were incredibly thrilled with these types of results. IPM clearly works, eliminates, dramatically reduces, in many cases, eliminates cockroaches. What surprised us, that as we eliminated cockroaches, we also dramatically reduced the allergen level. So here's the allergen level that we started with at the beginning of the study. The allergen level was substantially higher in the apartments that were destined to be treatment apartments, but it really doesn't matter. We had massive amounts of allergen at the beginning of the study. And 6 months later, the amount of allergen in the control apartments in blue remained the same, whereas the allergen level in our treated apartments declined dramatically. And in several of these homes, the allergen level went substantially below what we consider to be clinical threshold, substantially below what the medical community, the respiratory allergists consider to be sub-threshold to exacerbation of allergies and asthmatic type reactions. So a very important question here, these are incredible results that we can control the cockroaches. We also can reduce the allergen level with these treatments. A very important thing to understand, as I showed you before, that the presence of cockroaches, the presence of even 1 cockroach in the apartment, can deposit about 1,500 units of this allergen per day. And the human morbidity or illness threshold is only about 8 units of this allergen. And so if we control the cockroaches but don't eliminate the cockroaches, the remaining cockroaches continue to deposit allergen and contributing to the allergen load within the apartment. So it's very important to eliminate infestations, not just to control or to manage them. And so the question that came up in subsequent studies, and I won't have time to go through all these studies, but we invested a huge amount in the intervention. We invested in pest control with baits. We did whole home interventions, follow-ups using traps. We also did professional cleaning. We gave the residents a new vacuum with HEPA filter. We did resident education. And the question is, these great outcomes that we got, are they due to the pest control? Are they due to professional cleaning? Are they due to resident education? Or are they due to all of these combined? I don't have time to show you the data, but the results are very clear. That we did a subsequent study where we did bait treatment alone without professional cleaning, without resident education, and we got essentially the same results. So the message is that the baits alone can give us the same type of effect as this massive intervention with very expensive type of intervention. And here is the same apartment that I showed you before. When we apply bait, you can see these cockroaches immediately jumping on a bait and eating this bait. They eat it they really like these baits. And this type of infestation can be very readily controlled with bait use alone. Of course, it's great if you can go in there with these massive infestations and vacuum up a lot of these cockroaches so that you're not wasting bait. But in fact, the bait by itself, as long as you use enough bait to feed all these cockroaches, we can control cockroaches quite effectively. And these baits come in both professional products and consumer products, and we have shown that both products work essentially the same as long as you know how to apply these baits and you apply them in the proper places. So let's go back to the challenges with the use of baits and the challenges to IPM. What is it that prevents people from adopting IPM? There's this perception that IPM is expensive, and I think I've shown you that IPM is certainly, the use of baits is certainly not more expensive than the use of any other insecticides, certainly less expensive than TRFs. TRFs are much more expensive in terms of labor. And when people use 6 packs of TRFs, they become quite expensive. And when you blow up the apartment and destroy property, it becomes incredibly expensive. In terms of more labor, given the long-term residual activity of baits, clearly it does not, the baits require more labor up front. To put these individual dabs of baits require about 45 minutes per apartment up front. But given that you get long-term activity for up to 6 months or even longer, depending on the population of cockroaches, this type of labor at the beginning is certainly worth it because you're saving a lot of labor, a lot of callbacks, a lot of having to come back to this apartment over time. Some people consider the bait slow acting and they consider that to be a negative. They like to see this massive military type eradication of cockroaches. There is no such thing. I think it's actually better to have slow mortality, slow kill of cockroaches. When we treat them with baits, the cockroaches eat the bait, and if the bait doesn't kill them right away, the cockroaches have enough time to deliver the bait to their brothers and sisters and to cause secondary kill. And that's a very important property of bait. So we actually don't want baits that work too fast. We want to take advantage of this secondary kill. A real concern is, what about alternative foods? What about sanitation? Does that interfere with baits? Clearly, this is an issue. If you can improve sanitation, if you can remove alternative food, we have shown time and time again that the baits work much better. If you don't have a choice of many restaurants, you go to the one restaurant that's available. The same with cockroaches. It would be better to drive the cockroaches to our bait by eliminating all other food from the apartment. But even if we don't, even if we're lazy about sanitation, the baits are still expected to work, as I showed you in these types of apartments. The baits still work much better than any other product, any other formulation on the market. What about competing products? By far, the TRFs and so the consumer baits, the aerosol cans are a real obstacle to the baits. For some reason, the consumer views the TRFs and the sprays as more effective. They're so more militaristic. You're deploying something like a hand grenade, and somehow you get a sense of more accomplishment of that. But in fact, the baits are much, much more effective than any of these products. What about misapplication or low application? Every insecticide product can be misapplied. The baits can be misapplied as well. I see people using the baits, using gel baits as if they were caulking that's clearly a misapplication. Baits should be used in small dabs, only where cockroaches are. If you see the bait, you probably placed it in the wrong place. You should place the bait where you don't see it, but the cockroach does. So it should be behind, under cabinets, behind things where cockroaches like to spend their day hiding. Resistance is obviously an important issue. It's a very important issue for residual insecticides and total release foggers. It's emerging now as an issue for baits as well, and I'll show you some evidence to that effect. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about resistance. What is resistance? There are really two forms of resistance to insecticides. One form is called physiological resistance, which is a resistance to the insecticide itself. It's a resistance to the active ingredient in the formulation. And there are all sorts of different mechanisms for this resistance. The insects can metabolize the insecticides, for example. It can break it down, it can excrete it, it can do all sorts of things to make sure that the insecticide does not get to the target site within the insect. The other type of resistance is called behavioral resistance, and this is where the insect has developed all sorts of ways to avoid the insecticide. For example, the insect can move away from the treated surface. So you treat a surface with an insecticide, the insect either smells or tastes or perceives the insecticide and moves away from the insecticide. So it's behaviorally, it moves itself away from being contacted by the insecticide. And a new form of behavioral resistance is the non-consumption of insecticide because the insect senses something about the formulation that it doesn't like. And I'll show you an example of that. So here's an example of some work that a student in our lab here in North Carolina State University did. We had a population of German cockroaches from San Juan, Puerto Rico. And these German cockroaches could not be controlled with baits. They were treated with baits containing fipronil, hydromethalon, and indoxacarb. These are three very good active ingredients. And this population of cockroaches just could not be controlled by these baits. So we got a hold of these insects and did some work with them in the laboratory. So these are some products that contain fipronil, for example, Max Force. Here's a Max Force containing hydromethalon, and Advion is a product that contains indoxacarb. What Alex did was he took these cockroaches from the field, we call them PR for Puerto Rico 712, and exposed them for several generations to the insecticide fipronil. And after just several generations of selecting them with this insecticide, the resistance of these insects tripled very quickly from being only 5.6-fold resistant to being 16-fold resistant. The same thing with indoxacarb. He took this population from Puerto Rico that was 23-fold resistant to the insecticide, and within just a few generations of selecting them with indoxacarb, this population now is 13,000-fold resistance to the insecticide. You cannot kill them with this insecticide. And the same with hydromethalon. This population initially was about 4-fold resistant to the insecticide. After selection with hydromethalon, they're now 20-fold resistant to the insecticide. So the message from this work is back to sort of this Darwinian natural selection. If resistance to an insecticide emerges in the population and you continue using the same insecticide, you are bound to increase insecticide resistance and eventually result in a situation where you lose control of that population. So let's summarize insecticide resistance. Insecticide resistance can result in poor performance of commercial baits and, of course, of residual insecticides in some field populations, in some cockroach populations. There's now low levels of resistance that we have found, and in some cases actually high levels to indoxacarb, to fipronil, and recently even to hydromethalon. These are the major active ingredients that are insecticide baits. And resistance, as I showed you a minute ago, resistance increases with selection pressure. the more you use an insecticide bait consistently, continue to use the same bait over time, the more resistance you'll develop. So in other words, baits are not immune to the development of insecticide resistance. Baits are not sort of the panacea to insecticide resistance. We have to manage the way we use baits to make sure the insecticide resistance does not increase. A very important phenomenon that I want to touch on with just a couple of slides is that recently we have seen the emergence of sugar aversion in cockroaches. Sugars, various sugars, be it glucose or fructose or sucrose or maltose, a lot of different types of sugars are formulated into these bait products because the sugar, cockroaches love sugar, and the sugars cause the cockroaches, are there to cause the cockroaches to eat more of the bait. But over the last 20 years or so, we have seen this emergence of glucose aversion in the German cockroaches. This is a case where the cockroaches reject the bait, but they reject the bait not because they're resistant to the active ingredient, it's because they reject a nutrient within the bait, in this case, glucose. This is a genetically based change, and we have maintained a population of cockroaches that refuse to eat glucose. We have maintained that for more than 20 years in the laboratory. And I want to show you what this population looks like. This is a movie where we put peanut butter that does not contain glucose versus jelly that does contain glucose. And this is a glucose-averse population that we collected in the field in our apartment. And this is a wild-type population of cockroaches. You see the wild-type population, they feed both on the jelly and the peanut butter. Whereas this population here, they readily feed on the peanut butter, but absolutely refuse to touch the jelly. Here's a close-up. These cockroaches taste the jelly, but will refuse to eat the jelly because it contains glucose. So imagine if you had a population of cockroaches that you were trying to control, and your bait acted like this, the cockroaches would be eating everything else in the apartment and not touching your bait. So this is a very important concept in cockroach control, is to understand bait aversion and to understand that cockroaches actually have preferences for some foods and not others. And this is the last slide on bait aversion, just to show you, here's what happens in the laboratory. If we take a population that consists primarily of normal cockroaches in blue, nymphs and adult males and adult females, of normal cockroaches with a small percentage of glucose-averse cockroaches, if we expose these cockroaches for only 5 days of exposure to glucose bait, the normal cockroaches are exposed to this bait, they love it, and they die. And the glucose-averse cockroaches refuse to eat this bait, and they survive. And 60 days later, here's what you get. So you start with a population that's normal, glucose-loving, and a small fraction of it is glucose-averse. 60 days later, you end up with a very small fraction of the population that's normal, glucose-loving, and a very large fraction of the population that's glucose-averse. So with selection with a bait that cockroaches don't like, you can very quickly, within just a couple of generations, change the makeup of that population and not be able to control that population if you can continue to use a bait that contains glucose. So what is the answer to all of this? The answer is the cockroach keeps track of what we're doing. There's sort of this arms race between us and the cockroaches, and there's nothing new about this arms race. If we go back to the 1950s when we developed spray pesticides, we humans developed DDT and organochlorines, organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids, all kinds of insecticides, and the cockroaches very quickly developed resistance to these insecticides. In the 1980s, we developed baits containing glucose, and the cockroaches very quickly developed glucose aversion. In the 2000s, we switched our baits to containing fructose, and now we have cockroaches that refuse to eat both fructose and glucose. And this continues on. So in the present, we're developing other types of feeding stimulants and new insecticides, and I guarantee you that the cockroaches will keep up with us, because the cockroaches are very good at mutating and changing. And here is a headline, a title of a paper that was published back in 1989. The evolution of insecticide resistance. Have the insects won? And here's a quote from 1981 saying, "It will probably never again be possible to achieve chemical control of insects on the scale achieved between 1945 and 1965. 1945 and 65 is when we had DDT and chlordane and all sorts of other compounds to which the insects developed resistance, and we no longer can use them." So let me summarize. What can we do about all of this? What you can do is very effectively monitor the efficacy of various baits. As you use baits, as people use baits, it's very important to do what I call sort of a rapid taste test, where you put 2 or 3 different baits out there, wait for the cockroaches to come out, and see which of the baits the cockroaches prefer to feed on. This is sort of similar to the Coke challenge, right? And once you determine what the cockroaches like, you use that bait, and you use it for the next 3 to 6 months before you do the Coke challenge again and ask the cockroaches whether they've changed their taste, their preferences. It's very important to use multiple bait formulations, not just a single, not just the bait that's on sale, but to use different types of bait formulations, to rotate amongst different bait products, not to stick with a single product forever. And it's very important, and I can't overstate that, I think it's very important to eradicate infestations rather than simply to reduce infestations. Because when you eradicate, there's no selection for resistance. You have eliminated everything that's there. Whereas when you control populations, where you reduce the population, the remaining individuals that you have not killed are likely to be resistant to whatever insecticide you're using. And that small population that you have left behind will likely increase and develop into a resistant population. So a few tips for successful cockroach control: take the time to understand the infestation. Take the time to inspect, take the time to understand why the infestation is there, where is it coming from? Is it coming from the neighbors? If so, is there a way to seal the openings between the 2 apartments? Use what we entomologists like to call the fecal focal points. Wherever cockroaches go, they defecate. And if you follow that feces, and you can follow it with a flashlight, or you can use a UV light, sort of a black light, you can look at the fecal depositions of cockroaches. That sort of creates a roadmap of where the cockroaches are and where the bait placement should be. So the bait placement should be where the feces is, not where you think it's convenient to place the bait. It's very important to increase the number of bait placement when sanitation is poor, and that's a problem. The poorer the sanitation, the more other food is available to the cockroaches, the more you are competing, the bait is competing with that food, and the more important it is to have more bait placements. Be aware that bait depletion occurs all the time in very large populations. You put out bait, and overnight, the cockroaches can eliminate that bait. And if you want to keep after that population, you have to replenish the bait and put large amounts of bait out there if there's a large population of cockroaches. Generally, don't place new bait in the same location as old bait. Just move it a few inches just to give the cockroaches sort of a new place to. Don't move it too far, because cockroaches are lazy. They know there's bait, they know there's food in one place, so they like to visit that same place time and time again. Very important to use, we didn't talk about insect growth regulators, but there's some insect growth regulators that are quite effective in long-term cockroach control. There's some good evidence that some of these insect growth regulators also stimulate the cockroach to feed and to feed on baits. So they're a good combination of using baits with insect growth regulators. And if you want to save, basically, if consumers or professionals want to save on bait products because they consider them expensive, one can always go in with vacuums and remove large pockets of cockroaches before baiting. So you reduce the number of cockroaches that you're trying to bait with the gel bait. Again, I'm being repeating myself a little bit, but it's very important to avoid resistance. So use a variety of baits, so you're not selecting for insecticide resistance. Use a variety of baits with different active ingredients and different formulations. Incorporate IGRs and boric acid products. Boric acid dust is incredibly effective if used properly, but only in certain locations. Integrate any type of new chemistries. There's constantly new formulations of baits that are coming out with new active ingredients. Integrate those into the pest management program, and rotate through different bait products every 3 to maybe 6 months. Good sanitation is critical, as I already said, and it's very important to follow up with inspections and monitoring, not just to apply bait and go away for three or 6 months and see. It's very important to follow up and make sure the baits are working. And very important, if the problem persists, change what you're doing. Go back to here and use a variety of baits. If the problem persists, just don't keep doing the same thing, because the same thing is obviously not working. Okay, I will finish with thanking a bunch of people, a bunch of organizations that have sponsored the research in my lab. This is my lab group, which I want to thank for doing incredible work. And especially I want to thank the Department of Housing and Urban Development and their Healthy Homes program, the Alfred Sloan Foundation that has funded us, the NIHS, the EPA, and other agencies that funded us on this type of work. And I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There are a couple questions. I'm going to get to some of them. Some of them might have been answered, but I was paying attention to the chat box and I may have missed one or two of the answered questions. But a lot of people asked about insect growth regulators, and you answered that yes, they still are an effective control. Agreed.
Yes,
but
yes,
just used as one tool.
But very much so. But the insect growth regulators come in 2 different formulations. One formulation would be a spray type formulation that you mix into a tank mix. And generally we advise people, practitioners, not to put out baits first and then spray anything, whether it be a residual insecticide or an insect growth regulator, to separate where you spray and where you bait. Because we don't like spray products going over the baits. So that's the only caveat that I would have with the use of any type of spray product.
Okay. Also, boric acid, you mentioned, still is used, but it's limited as to where we can apply it. And I typically recommend it used in wall voids and out of reach of people. But Sam Bricks noted that he heard that it was being removed in some areas due to toxicity risks. Is that something that's
incredible? I haven't heard that, but
okay.
I tell you, boric acid is relatively the toxicity, the mammalian toxicity is incredibly low.
Okay.
But it's often misused. It's often applied improperly because people tend to apply gobs of dust when they have whether it's boric acid or silica gel. So again, boric acid is very effective, but you should not even see it after you apply it. You apply such a light dusting of boric acid only in places where you can't see it. So like you said, in wall voids, in cabinet voids, in the back of cabinets, just a very light dusting of boric acid. Cockroaches pick it up. It adheres to their cuticle. Cockroaches constantly groom themselves. And when they groom themselves, they eat the boric acid, they ingest it, and it kills them through ingestion. Very effective.
Great. And also you mentioned silica gel is also used for cockroaches too. We hear a lot about it as far as bed bugs, but is still an effective desiccant for
yeah, so silica gel works very differently from boric acid. Silica gel is a desiccant, whereas boric acid works primarily by ingestion. And I think of the difference between silica gel use and boric acid use. I think of silica gel as being placed in places where you absolutely cannot reach. So being able to, I would put silica gel into wall voids, whereas boric acid more in the back of cabinets. Boric acid would be something that you refresh, whereas silica gel is one of those things you put out there and don't have to worry about it for quite some time. Oftentimes, we think of silica gel as a very good material to use during construction into wall voids. So different uses of silica gel and boric acid.
Okay. Yeah, and there's another question from Stephanie Block that says, should we use one bait exclusively for 3 to 6 months before you move on to the next one, or should you use a variety of baits, then move on to another group of baits? So I think the question is, how often should baits be rotated?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Unfortunately, we don't have a data-driven answer to this. The concept that you introduced is one of rotation of baits versus mixtures of baits. Do you use different baits concurrently, or do you use them sequentially? If you do the taste test and one bait stands out as preferred, certainly start with that bait and use that bait exclusively for, let's say, 3 to 6 months, and repeat that preference test and see if you can find a product, if you can find another product that the cockroaches would like as well. I prefer to rotate through baits rather than to use them as mixtures, but there's really no data to support one approach over another.
Okay. Another question that came up a couple times is, how often should inspection and monitoring occur after the bait has been placed? How much time should lapse before the next application is applied if roaches still exist? So how long, and also how long does it take for baits to work? When should people start to see effects from it? And if they're not seeing effects from it, when to reapply, maybe with a different bait?
Yeah, these are really, really important practical, logistical type questions. The problem with answering those types of questions is because the key word is it depends.
It depends, yeah.
It depends on the population. If you have a big population, you're going to have to apply lots of bait. If you under apply the bait, you could be back in 3 or 4 days and see that all the bait has disappeared. And if you wait 3 months, you're not accomplishing anything because you're knocking a small percentage of the population down and are rebounding very quickly. So if you have a small population and you're applying a lot of bait, I would say come back in 2 weeks and have a look at, are they eating your bait? Have they consumed all of your bait? And are you knocking the population down? If you're doing a good job, you might need just a tiny bit of reapplication in some places, and then you don't have to come back for a month or 2 months or maybe even 3 months in some populations. But if you have a massive population, you applied a lot of bait, you need to come back, say, in 2 weeks and make sure that they're taking the bait. If they're not taking the bait, you need to apply a different bait and come back in 2 weeks and see if they're taking this bait. So it depends on if you are a manager in a building and it's easy to come back, I would come back within just a few days after application of the bait. But if it takes a lot of travel, if it's inconvenient, yes, wait a couple of weeks. I know it's not a very satisfactory answer because I don't have a formula that says, come back in 2 weeks, come back in 4 weeks, come back in 8 weeks. It all depends on whether the cockroaches are eating your bait or not.
Yeah, and that answers, Stephanie, your question. Stephanie Block says, what exactly is a lot of bait and how much? And I think that is an it depends answer as well.
Yes.
Dawn Gouge is chiming in about the boric acid, and she says that, yes, there is some research that boric acid causes testicular atrophy in male mice, rats, and dogs, and there are endocrine concerns. So that's new to me. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with those papers. They're papers that were published quite some time ago, and there are a few newer papers. But again, if you look at the the mammalian toxicity, if you look at the doses that were used in those studies, they're massive. They're very large doses. So, I'll give you a little bit of personal experience here. I just had cataract surgery a couple months ago. And for the last 2 months, I've been giving myself eye drops 3 times a day. The eye drops contain boric acid. Mm-hmm. So boric acid is commonly used in toothpaste and eye drops, and so now I'm not diminishing the fact that there's some toxicity associated with just about any insecticide. But it seems to me like boric acid, the toxicity I've seen associated with boric acid would not justify removing it from the market. I can't see that happening.
Okay, thank you. Couple more. I don't want to miss any. One that's easy to to answer. How long is the reproductive cycle, I guess, of the German cockroach?
Yeah, German cockroach is a complex cockroach. Unlike the American cockroach, so the German cockroach, the female makes an egg case, and then she carries that egg case for about 3 weeks. And she gives birth, hatching out that egg case while it's either still attached to the female, or she drops the egg case and immediately thereafter the babies hatch. And then it takes about a month and a half for those babies to become adults. So the life cycle basically is about 3 weeks in the egg stage and about a month and a half in the nympho stage. Does that answer? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. A lot of people have asked for specific product recommendations, and we generally tell people to look at the active ingredient. That's more important than the brand name. I know I just recently, I was looking at Dr. Deanie Miller's product list that she's got on the Virginia Tech, on her Virginia Tech resources website. I can share if you guys send me an email. But Dr. Schal, do you want to chime in on anything other than look at the active ingredient and?
So I will start with the formulation. I generally, in people's homes, where there's people and pets, I would tend to go to the baked formulation first. There are some extenuating circumstances where you might need to use a residual insecticide, but starting with the gel baked formulation or the baked station formulation, that's another alternative. Within those formulations, there are a bunch of different products. The ones that I mentioned, so the Advion, the Avert, the Max Force, what am I missing? Those are some of the major products. Now there are I guess Vendetta is another one. All of them contain different active ingredients. All of those are generally effective, but we are seeing more and more populations that are resistant to one or more of them. So it's always important to test them, to put them out, don't buy cases of product, buy some product, put it out, test it to make sure that it kills cockroaches, and then go for that product in large quantities. Products that contain baked formulations that contain boric acid often are less effective because the boric acid, unfortunately, that's formulated into these baked products are in massive amounts. They put 25 to maybe even 35% boric acid into these baked products, and cockroaches just don't like to eat that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So in my experience, baked products containing boric acid are a bit less effective than those containing some of these other active ingredients.
Okay. Well, I've got a couple really good ones coming up. How do you know when an infestation is totally eradicated? This one comes up all the time for us. Monitor.
Yeah, so there's two ways to do that. One is by visual inspection. So a really thorough visual inspection, sometimes using some material to flush them out. Even if you just have a can of compressed air, like the computer cleaners, the you can carry that with you and spray it into cracks and crevices. And if you're not flushing cockroaches out, if you don't see any cockroaches by a thorough visual inspection and you're not flushing them out, you probably have eliminated the cockroaches. In addition to that, in some key places, if you can put some roach motels, and many people complain about the fact that the roach motels don't attract cockroaches, that the roach motels are just kind of sitting there and the cockroaches blunder into them. You can put a roach motel and put the bait that you have used to control the cockroaches, put a little dab of that bait in the center of your roach motel to try to attract the cockroaches to the roach motel. And if you have something like 6 roach motels in the kitchen, that should give you pretty good coverage, as long as the roach motel is placed where the cockroaches are or used to be. And if you get nothing on the roach motels and you get nothing by visual inspection, and let's say you get that in 2 or 3 sequential visits, you have eradicated the population. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's another question from Shaku about any new developments with biocontrol agents or repellents. There was some recent questions on those.
Oh, on biocontrol agents, and what was the?
And repellents.
Repellents, yes. So biocontrol agents, there used to be products containing fungi, metarhizium specifically. There used to be a product called Ecopath, made by a company called Ecoscience. That went under. It was quite effective in the laboratory, but not a whole lot of efficacy in the field. A lot of the biocontrol agents are very susceptible. They work well in humid environments. They don't work so well in the dry environment of the home, especially in the winter where the humidity drops quite a bit. So the short answer is there are no new developments that I'm aware of. People are constantly experimenting and publishing on fungi for the control of cockroaches, but nothing that I've seen that would compete with the baits. In terms of repellents, we have done a lot of work on repellents as well. In the laboratory environment, we can show that repellents work very well against cockroaches. We can drive them from one side of a cage to the other side of the cage. In apartments, you cannot put repellent thoroughly enough to repel cockroaches. Cockroaches will walk over any repellent, just like bed bugs will walk over repellent to get to food. Bed bugs will walk over repellent to get to us, their host, and cockroaches will walk over repellent to get to their food if they're hungry enough. So I wish we had effective biocontrol agents and repellents, but I'm afraid what's available in the marketplace now is not even close to competing with the baits.
Okay.
And I would caution about the use of repellents, because if you start combining repellents with baits, you start making the mistake of putting repellents on baits. Mm-hmm. And that's a real no-no. So be really careful about using things like essential oils. And so essential oils are highly volatile, and they can volatilize and settle on the bait and make the bait ineffective. And so you're really working against yourself.
Okay. One question that came up before that I've always had is after the baits have dried and they're hardened, how long are they effective for after you apply them? Are they still effective after they've dried? And
they can be, but very likely not. So
okay.
what's really effective about the gel baits is that the fact that they have this high water content. One of the very first slides that I showed you is that cockroaches need water. Water is very important for cockroaches, and they go for these gel baits both because it contains nutrients, but also because it contains water. Once that water evaporates, in the first 24 hours that the bait is out, there's a massive loss of water from that bait. But then there's a continuous loss of water over the next month or so. Once the bait completely dries up, it really becomes ineffective. So if it completely dries up and it's still there, it's a good idea. It takes a bit of work, but it's a good idea to take a screwdriver and kind of remove the bait and place new bait next to it.
Okay. This is the last question just because I don't know how to answer this one. So would you want to clarify or expand on why you prefer sequential usage of different baits instead of multiple baits at once? Any reason or just a preference?
Yeah, preference? So the concept, this is complicated. Let me take you to the medical literature. I think all of you have heard that the big discovery in HIV, fighting HIV/AIDS, the big discovery is the cocktail effect. You use a cocktail of drugs, and the cocktail just overwhelms the virus. Okay, and when we talk about mixtures, the idea is to use a cocktail that overwhelms the cockroach. But when you're using different placements of different baits, you're actually not mixing them. Each cockroach is eating a different bait. So you're not accomplishing the same thing as the theoretical models tell us that a cocktail might be good. But using several different products in different places in the home is not expected to be as good as mixing all these baits together. The problem with using multiple baits at the same time is that you may be selecting for resistance against all these baits at the same time. Whereas when you're rotating, you get a couple of generations on one bait, and then switch them to a different bait, and you are so preventing the evolution of rapid evolution of resistance to a single active ingredient. We can talk and argue about this a lot because there's no data to support either one of these approaches with cockroaches. People have studied this with bacteria and with viruses, and some of the agricultural researchers have studied that with agricultural pests. But with agricultural pests, remember that you have only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 generations a year in the summer. With cockroaches, we have a continuously growing population, and we can have up to 8 generations a year. So it's much more, the selection pressure is much more intensive on cockroaches than it is on agricultural pests.
Okay, well, if there are any unanswered questions, we're going to close it down now, but if there are any unanswered questions, you can email myself or Dr. Schal. Gave his contact information at the beginning. I'm putting up my last page, and you can see our website on the page, and you can contact us through the website, request a training, look for pest solutions. And there's one final question that's for me. Will there be a similar training on bed bugs anytime soon? And I think we're about due for one. So maybe our next webinar, we'll schedule a bed bug webinar and hopefully a rodent webinar as well in the near future. So stay tuned, get connected with Stop Pests through our website and our social media and through email. If you have any other questions, you can send them to stoppests@cornell.edu. And the website that I put up a number of times will have the recording, the PDF of the presentation, and a certificate of completion. So stay in touch, and we will have resources for you up on the website. And thank you very much, Coby Shaw, for your presentation. There were a ton of people that said wonderful presentation and that they're going to share this widely. So I appreciate everybody sharing it and getting the word out. Thanks very much, and have a great afternoon.